In this video, we will look at risk planning, and this will be the last video in Complete the Plan. Let's define risk. Risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has an effect on the project. So anything that has an impact, either positively or negatively on a project, can be considered a risk. There are 4 steps in risk management planning. We call this the 4 steps of risk management process. First of all, you identify your risk. You must analyze your risk. You must come up with a plan for that risk. And then lastly, you must have some sort of mechanism of how you monitor and control the risk so that you will know when the risk is actually going to occur. Risk identification is one of the easiest steps in identifying risk. Simply because we ask this question, what can go wrong with this plan? Now, people can always find things that will go wrong with your plan. So be prepared that when you ask this question of anyone, stakeholders, team members, anyone that has a vested interest in your project, that you will get a lot of answers back and a lot of ideas of what can go wrong with your plan. Here's some tools or approaches we can use to identify risks. One is we can do brainstorming, as we demonstrated earlier when we did the work breakdown structure. Just give everyone stickies, get them to write down what they think the risk is and put it on the wall and organize it from there. We can do interviews. We can do an interview one-on-one. We can do an interview with the groups. We can interview departments. We can interview outside people and gather from them what they think the risks are to the project. The next thing is our assumptions. Every assumption that we rate in our project charter is in fact a risk because the assumption is written in a positive manner. So we're saying, for example, our budget is approved. The risk is our budget doesn't get approved. We can look at checklists, and we can buy checklists from organizations, especially if we're in a specialized area. And then we can get checklists from there, or we can create our own. The other way we can look at historical projects, and we can look at the risks associated with those projects, and we can ask the question whether those risks are still valid with our project. And those are the tools that we can use to identify risk. This is another template we use in project management just to record every risk that we have. And regardless of the risk, every risk should be recorded in a register. And what you do is you track that risk and you can determine whether it's active or not, as you can see here. And once it's not active, you don't have to worry about it anymore. And you'll see on this little template, we have a P and an I there. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. So as mentioned in the previous slide, we talked about doing a risk analysis, and the P stands for probability and the I stands for impact. So when we look at a risk, we want to look at the probability of that risk actually occurring. And then we want to look at the impact as if that risk did occur. And this is a little grid. You can use a number and you can go 1 to 5, 1 to 10, up the left-hand side and down the bottom. Either way you want to do it, or you can use a color system like this. But the whole idea is to take each one of your risks and ask yourself, what is the probability of this risk actually occurring? And if the risk does occur, what is the impact of this? Now let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's say, for example, that you live in an earthquake area, but you haven't had an earthquake in 100 years. Now, the probability of that earthquake to your project, the probability of actually occurring during the length of your project is probably very, very low. But the impact to your project, if the earthquake actually happens, is very, very high. So you can see by doing that you can see that the probability and impact are opposing each other. And what you really need to focus on, because you have so many risks, you need to really focus on the areas that are up in this quadrant, high impact and high probability. And we say when you have high impact and high probability, you should most definitely create a project response plan or risk response plan for those risks. You've now analyzed your risks. Now what you need to do is, for those high impact and high probability risks, you need to do some planning. So the plans to handle risk should be appropriate and consider the priority of the risk and the cost of the risk and the timing of the risk. So when you create a plan, the plan can't occur more cost or take longer than if you just allowed the risk to actually occur. So one thing that happens with project managers, they have very elaborate plans for when a risk actually happens. And the reality is that costs more and takes longer than if the risk actually occurred. So when you create your plans, make sure you understand the priority of the risk. Make sure it's only for the high impact and high probability areas. Make sure the cost is not greater than if the risk actually occurred, and make sure it takes less time than the time it would take to adjust to the risk if it actually occurred. So now we're going to look at some common responses to how you do risk planning. You can do avoidance. Avoidance basically means don't do whatever that task was that's too risky. Just don't do it. Replace it with some other tasks. Yeah, next thing is transference, where you can actually transfer that risk from your area to some other area. An example of this, if you have something that requires specialized knowledge, but you don't actually have those skills in your area, what you do is you may hire a contractor to do that. And so therefore it's up to them to ensure that that task gets done correctly. All right. Now, just remember one important thing. Even though you transferred the risk over to the contractor, you're still responsible to make sure the contractor performs as per the contract. The next thing you do is mitigation. Mitigation is where you actually come up with a detailed plan of how you're going to overcome the risk and handle risk when it actually occurs. Or you can do what's called acceptance. You can just accept it, and you can say, okay, I'm going to accept this risk actively and produce a contingency. And that means allocate funds, time, and energy to handle that risk. Or passively just say, well, we'll worry about it when it happens. So those are the keys that you can use to do risk planning. This is the end of this video, and actually the end of the videos for Complete the Plan.